The Noahide Blueprint, Trump National Sabbath Proclamation. Everyone, Johnny here, Don't Speak News. And I've had some comments and I've had some emails asking me about this subject, and so we're just going to get into it today. But I'm glad I waited a couple days because Yana Banoon just came out with a really good blog on this particular subject. And that makes sense because she has a blog on Substack that exposes the Noahide laws and defends the faith of Jesus Christ. So here we go, right? So why the call for the national Sabbath is more than a gesture. It's a calculated shift to replace our constitutional liberties with a state-sanctioned Judaic religious identity. Right. And you'll notice that they don't talk anything about the New Testament whatsoever at all, because worshiping Jesus Christ under the Noahide laws will be considered idol worship, for which you can be beheaded. And I'm sure that's what it will come to, and not in the very distant future. This is going to happen really quick. So I have received so many emails, she says, over the last few days from readers who were stunned by Donald Trump's recent proclamation of a national Sabbath, and they all asked me the same thing. Is this a step toward an Noahide society? And yes, I absolutely believe it certainly is, and it's coming in small steps that most people will barely notice until the trap is already set, and I agree wholeheartedly. And this is why the Hebrew roots movement and the sacred name movements are so dangerous to Christianity, because they're not Christian. They're trying to bring us back to the old covenant, to the laws of Moses and the prophets, which were fulfilled by Jesus Christ. And now we are under the new covenant. But all of these Hebrew roots folks want to drag us back to the old one. And now they're probably celebrating that this is being put into place by Trump. It wouldn't surprise me if they were. So what we're watching is the lines between the church and the state dissolve in real time, and it's happening under the guise of heritage and unity. When a president stands up and issues a formal call for a Judaic religious day of rest, he's not just honoring a Jewish tradition, but he is setting a precedent for the government to regulate our time and our worship. Indeed. This started with the announcement for a Jewish American Heritage Month, where Trump asked the Jewish community to dedicate the Sabbath of May 15th to May 16th to the national celebrations of America's 250th anniversary. And Trump becomes the first U.S. president to call for a national Sabbath. Well, keep in mind, he converted to Judaism back in 2017. So of course he's going to be all for this, along with his daughter who converted as well before he did. So on the surface, it sounds like a nice gesture, but look at the language being used. Yes, the devil's always in the details, as they say. An article recently published in the Times of Israel titled National Shabbat, Why All Americans Should Mark the 250th, pulls back the curtain on the real agenda. And here's a link to that particular article. The author, David Neukertman, points out that this proclamation is a landmark moment because it's the first time a president has integrated a specific Jewish religious observance into the formal framework of the nation. He says this represents a landmark moment in American history. While U.S. presidents have a long tradition of issuing proclamations for national days of prayer or general religious holidays, this 2026 proclamation is the first time a president has issued a formal call for a national Sabbath to be observed by the Jewish people, specifically to honor American independence. It marks a significant departure from the standard executive practice, integrating a specific Jewish religious observance into the formal framework of the nation's 250th anniversary, with which the Jews had nothing to do with. But anyway, he writes that the administration has uniquely mirrored the Jewish halakhic, or religious law definition of the Sabbath, within an official state document by noting it should last from sundown to nightfall. Yep, that's the way they did it. The proclamation is inextricably linked to the Rededicate 250 initiative, a broader national jubilee described as a weekend of prayer, praise, and thanksgiving for the nation's 250 years of freedom. By using religiously specific language noting the observance should last from sundown to nightfall, the administration has uniquely mirrored the Jewish halakhic Jewish law definition of the Sabbath within an official state document. This is where it gets dangerous for every single American that is not Jewish. The article argues that this should not just be a Jewish event, but a clarion call to non-Jews across the entire nation. And of course, I don't agree with that, but he says it's a profound gesture recognizing the deep spiritual and historical ties between the Jewish people and the American project. Yes, you've been taking our money and stealing it for years, hundreds of years. He says, I couldn't agree more with the sentiment. However, for truly to honor the essence of the Sabbath and the spirit of this milestone, that celebration must extend its reach. The Sabbath should not just be a Jewish event, it should be a clarion call to non-Jews across the nation. Yes, they want to force us into their Sabbaths and their holidays, their new moons and their festivals. He uses what many of us recognize as Noahide language to bridge the gap between the Jewish faith and the rest of the world. The author describes a tripod of perspectives that should apply to everyone, starting with the idea that the Sabbath is an acknowledgement of a Jewish God as creator, which recognizes a power higher than the state. While that sounds spiritual, it's actually a legalistic framework being built to suggest that our national identity as Americans is not sustained by our Constitution, but by a social covenant rooted in the Jewish understanding of the Hebrew Bible. The Times of Israel piece goes even further by quoting the prophet Isaiah to suggest a future where the Sabbath transcends all tribal boundaries and all flesh will worship together and read to them this Torah, which they don't even follow anymore. What they consider Torah is their Talmud and their witchcraft-based Kabbalah and the Zohar and all that garbage. Satanic, all of it. They don't even follow the Old Testament books anymore. This burden does not rest solely on the shoulders of the government. It rests on the citizens of the country, he says. We should look to the book of Deuteronomy for our blueprint. Yeah, right. Gather the whole nation together, the men, the women, the children, and read to them this Torah. Even though Jesus Christ fulfilled all of it, all the laws of Moses and the prophets. So yes, Mr. President, let the Jewish people lead the way, he says. Next Shabbat, but let the doors of the synagogue and the hearts of the faithful be open to all. Let us use this appointed time to renew the American covenant, ensuring that for the next 250 years we remain a nation that seeks to be the light to the world. Unreal. It claims that America is a nation rooted in the concept of Judaic covenant and that the opening words of the preamble are far more than a legal contract, but are instead the formal signature of a social covenant. This is exactly how a Noahide society is built, by convincing the population that their rights are tied to a specific Judaic religious interpretation of the law, rather than their individual civil liberties. When the author says that the beauty of a covenantal nation is that it possesses a unique capacity for self-renewal, he's talking about changing the very foundation of how our country operates. And the world, too, not just the U.S. We're being told that the preservation of this Judaic covenant is a duty shared by every citizen, and that we should look to the book of Deuteronomy for our blueprint, to gather the whole nation, including the men and women and children, to hear the Torah. This is no longer about personal faith or private prayer, and notice, the New Testament is completely left out. Of course it is. Worshipping Jesus Christ is going to be considered idolatry. This is about moving toward a state where the government and rabbinic religious leaders work together to define what so-called responsible freedom looks like. If we allow the state to begin scheduling our days of reflection and defining which religious laws are the bedrock of our national identity, we're handing over the keys to our conscience. And this is how it happens. It starts with a proclamation that seems very inclusive and a celebration of a milestone anniversary. It's supported by articles that use beautiful spiritual language about Jews being a light to the world. But beneath those words is a structural change that moves us away from being a republic of free individuals and toward a society managed by Judaic religious mandates. We must be extremely careful when the state starts using the language of the sanctuary to describe the business of the government, because once that door is open, it's very hard to close. Back in 2015, David Krupman published an article in the Times of Israel highlighting an Orthodox rabbinic statement that fundamentally redefines the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. He celebrated the impact of the Second Vatican Council and the 1965 Nostra Aetate document, which he credits with starting an irrevocable change in Catholic teaching by rejecting anti-Semitism and affirming the eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people. Well, the Catholic Church is apostate anyway. They're not Christian whatsoever at all. And I'm not trying to insult Catholics listening to this broadcast, but your leadership is completely apostate and always has been. But anyway, this shift, according to the statement Krupman promotes, moved Christians from being seen as enemies to being recognized as unequivocal partners in a shared, albeit Noahide, mission to perfect the world. And of course, the Catholics are the ones, and I showed you last week, are teaching Noahide law classes in their parishes now. By leaning on the authority of the Catholic Church as pivot, he frames Christianity as a willed divine outcome designed to bring the nations into a specific moral alignment. Crucially, the 2015 text reveals the legal mechanism behind this partnership, the Universal Noahide Covenant. It says, "We believe that God employs many messengers to reveal his truth, while we affirm the fundamental ethical obligations that all people have before God, that Judaism is always taught through the Universal Noahide Covenant," which comes from their Talmud. It has nothing to do with Scripture. You'll find it nowhere in the Bible. Nowhere. Go look in the book of Genesis. You'll never find it there. In imitating God, Jews and Christians must offer models of service, unconditional love, and holiness. Oh, they don't believe in Jesus Christ. What part does light have with darkness? They're in the dark. If you don't have the Son, you don't have the Father. They say that we're all created in God's holy image, and Jews and Christians will remain dedicated to the covenant by playing an active role together in redeeming the world. Well, which covenant are you referring to? Because I live in the new one, not the old one. By identifying the Noahide covenant as the fundamental ethical obligation for all non-Jews, the statement establishes a clear hierarchy, where ethical monotheism serves as the bridge to wrap secular nations into a Judaic legal blueprint. For those who have been tracking this movement, it's not difficult to see that the recent National Sabbath proclamation by Trump is simply the next logical step in the practical application of the new Noahide USA. But what did Jesus teach? While Krugman argues in some of his articles and podcasts that Jesus was simply a Jew operating within Jewish law, the New Testament provides several key breakpoints where Jesus introduced concepts that were fundamentally incompatible with the Judaic belief. The Judaic and Noahide systems are built on legalism, specific external actions, Sabbath keeping, dietary laws, ritual purity, and all of that stuff, and that's all works. Jesus shifted the focus from the action or works to the internal state of the heart. In the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, begins in Matthew 5, Jesus repeatedly says, "You've heard it said, but I say to you." He wasn't just interpreting the law, he was raising the bar to an internal standard that the old Judaic legal system couldn't touch. Jesus taught that the external covenant is meaningless without internal transformation, being born again. Rendering the state-mandated national Sabbath spiritually void, means nothing. When Jesus talked to the Samaritan woman at the well, he told her that a time was coming when people would worship God on a specific mountain nor in Jerusalem, but instead in spirit and truth. By claiming that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, Jesus demoted the Sabbath from a legal requirement to a secondary tool for human well-being. Yes, we should all take a day of rest, absolutely. That's what the Sabbath was made for man. But Jesus demoted the Sabbath from a legal requirement to a secondary tool for human well-being. To mandate it at a national level is to revert to a shadow that Jesus claimed to have fulfilled and moved past. Exactly. Jesus introduced grace, which is a fundamentally anti-covenantal in the legal sense. Grace is a gift that cannot be earned by following a Jewish religious system. The Krugman's call to renew the American covenant by gathering the nation to hear the Torah is a call to return to a works-based identity, and that's why it's so wrong and antichrist. Jesus' new covenant was a radical departure that established a relationship based on his sacrifice, not on a nation's ability to follow a blueprint from Deuteronomy that nobody up until Christ could follow. He's the only one that could ever follow it. He fulfilled it. It's over. But everybody wants to keep running back to it. If you want to hear how evil that is, go listen to Matt Powell over here. In this particular video, the 10 reasons the Hebrew Roots movement is not Christian, and he'll tell you all about it. He was in it. And he watched fellow Christians convert to Judaism and renounce Christ. He couldn't do it. He had to walk away. He would not renounce Christ. And he came back to the faith. But he was heading in the same direction as the rest of the people he was with. That's why it's so dangerous, and that's why I'll always speak out against it. So now, Jesus explicitly rejected theocratic power. When offered the kingdoms of the world, he refused. When questioned by Pilate, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Jesus never asked for a national Sabbath or a social covenant with Rome or any other government. He called for a kingdom of individuals. By focusing on Hebraic roots and national Sabbaths, the Krugman and Trump are actually negating the unique message of Jesus. Yeah, they're trying to negate everything he said. They're trying to pull people back into a legalistic Judaic Noahide system where the state acts as the enforcer of the covenant. Jesus did not come to make an old covenant universal for non-Jews. He came to establish a new covenant that made the old legalistic structures, like a government-mandated Sabbath, obsolete. And Yana, I could not agree more. He established a new covenant that obliterated the old legalistic structures. It's a mandated Sabbath is obsolete. Our Sabbath rest is in Christ Jesus. We've entered into God's rest when we accept Christ. Hebrews 4:10. I mean, I could go on and on about that, but I'm not gonna. All I wanted to do in this particular episode is cover what you guys have been asking me about, and I found a good source to cover it with. And that will be it for now. God bless, take care. Johnny Storm, Don't Speak News.